Anybody who is in college and is considering going to law school, or if you're just curious. The LSAT stands for the Law School Admissions Test. It's the primary admissions test for most US and Canadian law schools. The test structure in the current format, it's 2 logical reasoning sections, 1 reading comprehension section, 1 unscored experimental section, 2 hours of total testing time. Scoring for the test, score range goes from 120 to 180. The number that you want to hit to get admission to the top law school is about 170. It opens up the admissions process to the top law schools. It opens up scholarship opportunities. That number is very, very important.
This is why I would never go to law school. I don't like this sort of question. I don't like these sort of readings. I'm sure that if I was forced to do it, I could do it well enough, but not something that I would find enjoyment. And what we do in medical school is completely different. We learn it, brute force memory, and then as we go along, we then connect the dots. So you're kind of seeing a progression, whereas this is kind of just analysis by analysis and analysis. That's a lot more than I would like to do, especially with words. Medicine,
Law, friendship. This is Dr. Long and Lawyer Nik. You're listening to the Medico-Legal Brief.
one doctor, one lawyer, and a whole lot of gray area.
Welcome back to the Medico-Legal Brief, where medicine meets the law. I'm Lawyer Nik. I'm with Dr. Long. We have a pretty fun episode today, Dr. Long. In previous podcasts, we walked through hypotheticals, we walked through philosophical problems, and today I want to press on the doctor a little bit. We are going to walk through LSAT Questions, which is the entry exam to get into law school. So what are your thoughts about rapid fire questions and then giving us some answers?
A little nervous. Obviously, the last time I took a test has been a while, especially a college grade test, but curious to see what style of questions there are and what sort of topics are on the LSAT.
Yeah, the LSAT is pretty much critical thinking. I mentioned this before. You don't really need to know the law. You don't need to be familiar with the law in order to do well on the LSAT. It's more so trying to bring out that type A logical critical thinking. However, we've both joked, like, your brain goes both ways. You are able to think very critically, type A, but you also have the creative side that exists, your type B personality. I found that when I took it, I had to put that creativity away. There's a right answer to these questions, and you can't think so far outside the box, because then it's going to definitely bring you down the path to the wrong answer. But before we begin, you had mentioned that you haven't really taken a test like this in forever. Do you feel like, with having kids and seeing education system and dealing with students, do you ever feel like if you were to go back in this current moment as a professional, you could take all these tests over again and probably fail, even though you are a decade removed and you are a professional in the industry? Have you ever felt that way?
Well, of course. The thing with the medical field is we do a lot of tests up until you graduate residency, and then you start weaning down in terms of how many times you test, but there's still a lot of continuing educational stuff. The tests that we did at the very beginning of our education, so what we call step 1, is the hardest exam that we have out there, and they actually no longer put a score on it. Now it's just pass or fail because of how high stakes it was and how stressful it was for a lot of students to take that. And that's basically the test that determines whether or not you can go into the specialty you want to go into.
Yeah, very similarly, when I look at bar exam questions, we'll have another episode where you work through bar exam questions, and I'll probably work through some MCAT questions. But even now, if I was to go back and try to test for the bar, being a lawyer out for over a decade, I would probably fail the bar. I would have to go back and probably retake classes, retake some prep stuff, just because you study so hard for something, and then all that information is fleeting, especially if you don't use it. If you're not going into a specialty or a specialization, it's just one ear out the other.
So you guys don't have, like, every 5-10 years you have to retake a test?
No. In law, at least in the state of Texas, you don't have to retake any tests. What you do have to do is CLEs, continuing legal education, where you just go and you listen to somebody talk, or you go to a conference. They even have self-study hours, where I've taken that to read constitutional law books, read about real estate law, and just study up on different areas. So no actual formal testing, other than if you're going to get additional certification or specializations like we've talked about in previous podcasts. To that point, I haven't taken a test in forever. And I actually still have dreams about college and law school where I'm taking those tests and I'm failing, and I wake up, I'm like, okay, it was just a nightmare. It's not happening. I passed, I got through it.
In the medical field, we do take still do take tests, but they've changed the formatting of that. You take your board exam, which is your specialty exam, to say that, hey, you have now board certified to practice in family medicine or to be a general surgeon. And then the way it used to be was every 10 years you would retest and do the same board again. And it's that big 400 to 500 question test that you have to take all in one day. You would usually have to take 1 or 2 weeks prior to restudy for everything so that you can go in and pass the exam. But nowadays they've reformatted, and a lot of these board societies have changed it to a longitudinal status where you are doing questions over a span of time rather than doing one big high stakes exam. So instead of doing the 400, 500 questions all in one day, you're doing it over a span of 10 years. So every quarter you get given a chunk of questions that you have to complete, which is nice. It's a lot less stressful.
Yeah. But when when that point of the quarter comes around, is it frustrating where you think to yourself, well, I don't want to do this. I have other things to worry about. I have my family and my career and my job, and I have patients I need to see. I don't need to just sit here, and I don't want to take this test.
The nice thing is that you do it at your own leisure. You can start and stop it at your own time, and you usually do it at home or whenever you have fun free time.
You may have answered this already or may have mentioned it. Is it open book as well? To where
Yes, there are time limits, right? Each question only has a certain amount of minutes that you're allowed to answer. You could try to look some things up, but you really have to know at least the base root of the question to be able to answer it quickly enough.
Wow.
Because if you have to having to completely look up a whole new topic, you wouldn't have enough time.
Not that I want to get too far down the rabbit hole of previous episodes, but I wonder how Chat GPT or AI would fare if you were to just take the question on a side iPad or on your phone, put it in really fast, and how accurate it could end up being and helping you out to get through those questions. But with that, before we start, I wanted to get into a little bit of background on the LSAT for our listeners. Anybody who is in college and is considering going to law school, or if you're just curious. The LSAT stands for the Law School Admissions Test. It's the primary admissions test for most U.S. and Canadian law schools, and it is administered by the LSAC, which is the Law School Admission Council. The test structure in the current format, it's 2 logical reasoning sections, 1 reading comprehension section, 1 unscored experimental section, 2 hours of total testing time, and previously it had logic games, but that was removed in 2024. I remember the logic games. Logic games were some of my favorite, where it's like you have these 5 people running a race. A came in second, B came in third, but C was before A and D. It gets a little confusing, but they're fun to toy out. Scoring for the test. The score range goes from 120 to 180. The average score is about 153, 154. And the lucky number, the number that you want to hit to get admission to the top law school, is about 170. Everybody strives for that 170 mark. It opens up the admissions process to the top law schools. It opens up scholarship opportunities. That number is very, very important. You get about 120,000 test takers each year, and it's offered multiple times annually. So it's nearly year round. If you ever are thinking about taking the test, obviously you want to look at your career path as far as when you need to apply to law school. But you could take the test early in one year, get your score, and then see what your options are as you go into the admissions period. And then why it matters, they say that the LSAT is a strong predictor of first-year law school performance, and it lends itself to the critical thinking aspect of it. If you're successful on the LSAT, the notion is that you'll be successful in your first year of law school. Along with your GPA, it's the most important thing. From a law school perspective, we've talked about what it takes to get into law school and get into medical school. Your GPA and your LSAT are some of the most important things.
It sounds very similar to the MCAT, the test that you have to take to apply to medical school, except our test is a little bit longer. If I remember correctly, it was closer to 4 to 6 hours for us. And we have several different science sections. And then you also have an English section as well as a psychology, sociology section. And again, we'll go over that in another episode if our viewers want to comment below and just let us know if you're interested to hear about the MCAT and have Lawyer Nik do a couple questions.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see how they intertwine and how the mind works for each one, because obviously you want to have certain things that'll bring out the success aspect of the student, but you're looking at 2 very, very prestigious exams, prestigious tests to get into prestigious schools, and I'm just curious as to how they overlap and how they differ.
Yeah.
Okay. So Long, when you're looking at any sort of testing, obviously you can go out and you can pay for testing and pay for the books and possibly private tutoring, YouTube videos, video testing. There's a lot of different resources out there to try to make you successful. Now, if you're wondering if you should take the LSAT or how you could fare, you can go on and look for free testing resources. Here, I didn't want to pay for anything. I just want to find some free testing resources that Dr. Long and I could use. So this is via lawhub.org. We're going to have them up on the screen. So our listeners, if you're watching the video of it, you can go along with us. I will read the question out loud. And then Long, I want you to just kind of stream of consciousness, work your way through it. Okay. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, question one, logical reasoning. Simone and Juana's statements most strongly indicate that they disagree over whether, and then there's 5 different answers to choose from. So Simone, technology is now available that through precise alteration of human genetic material can prevent some of the more severe complications caused by genetic diseases. Thus, a role for medical science is to use this technology to stop these diseases before they lead to serious problems. We should not hinder medical progress out of fear of possible abuses of it. Juana, you are trading one set of problems for a considerably more dangerous set. If you allow the use of technology to tamper with human genetic material, only imagination sets limits to the tragedies that could ensue. I'm actually excited that this brings a little bit of medical sciences in for Dr. Long. But Long, before we go into the questions, I'll give you a second to read it yourself. That way you can work your way through it.
Interesting. Okay. Give me a minute here because I usually write down notes when I'm taking these tests.
You didn't bring your legal pad?
No. Okay. It's going to be E. It's going to be E.
All right, E. So if we're working through the questions, Simone and Juana's statements will strongly indicate that they disagree over whether A, medical science should be involved in any genetic research on human beings. B, genetic diseases represent a serious health problem for human beings. C, altering human genes to prevent one set of genetic diseases will only lead to the creation of a new set of genetic diseases. D, altering human genetic material to stop disease will have ill effects. Or E, the risks involved in stopping disease by altering human genetic material are worth taking. So you've landed on E, correct?
Yep.
And how did you get there?
They both agree that the medical sciences are there to help alter human genetic material, and it will result in some sort of effect. Juana just it feels like it's a setback that is worse. The risks outweigh the benefits, whereas Simone feels like the benefits outweigh the risks. But they both are discussing the ultimate risks of what comes of it. So E would be the ultimate answer.
Okay, let's go ahead and see. Show the answer, and it looks like E is correct. Good job. As a tip for LSAT and any test, and you may feel the same way, when you're reading the question and you're reading the answer, before you even look at the options that you have, you try to come up with the answer yourself as to what it would be. And then if you can find that answer in the answer solutions, you might be on to the right answer. But here, the question is going to be, which one of the following most logically completes the book reviewer's final sentence? The book reviewer. The author's aim is to show that Emilio Vitola is one of the most underrated artists of the last century. But whereas he cites a wealth of negative assessments by other art historians, he does little to show that these assessments are wrong. And it must be confessed that the book's reproductions of Vitola's works reveal no artistic skill whatsoever. Thus, the author is, and then you have your answers there. So A, not successful in fulfilling his intentions. B, the author is insufficiently aware of the works of his predecessors. C, the author is unduly motivated by the desire to create controversy. D, the author is likely to change readers' minds about the works of Vitola. Or E, the author is unfair in his reporting of the views of others.
The answer would be A, and the reason being is the author's goal is to show that Vitola is an underrated artist, but the reviewer says that he doesn't really support that statement with any evidence, and all he really does is talks about the negative assessments by other historians. Logically, so it would then be finalized that the final sentence should be the author is not successful in fulfilling his intentions.
All right, is A your final answer? Let's see. You are correct. How are you feeling so far? 2 questions in to the LSAT.
Pretty good so far. Maybe I'll go to law school.
You could. Look, I would say that anybody could go to law school. All it takes is drive and the ability to work hard to understand, because the theories aren't that hard, like legal theory and the law isn't that hard to comprehend. It's just one of those things where you gotta persevere, you gotta go through adversity. I could never go through med school. There's a lot of lawyers out there that can never take the med school route, but I would be the first to say that a doctor, especially with what you guys have gone through previously, you have the drive and the, intellect to go through and go be a lawyer. Just want to put that out there. I'm not trying to fluff you up, but you
Thanks.
can definitely go to law school. We're on to the third question. Which one of the following, if true, most supports the claim made in the last sentence of Hasina's argument? Hasina, our province has enacted new workplace standards to protect employees from repetitive stress injuries. The new law requires businesses employing at least 9 workers to create safer working conditions on the job and permits the workers to demand specific solutions for their problems. This law should be widely enforced. If it is, it will dramatically reduce the number of repetitive stress injuries in our province. Again, which one of the following, if true, most supports the claim made in the last sentence of Hasina's argument? A, most people in the province who experience repetitive stress injuries work for businesses that have at least 9 employees. B, recently, public awareness of repetitive stress injuries have greatly increased, and consequently, the incidence of repetitive stress injury is already going down. C, measures are now being taken that will guarantee the wide dissemination of information about the law, as well as its consistent enforcement. D, some of the largest businesses in the province have already voluntarily instituted standards similar to those of the new law. E, the new law also contains measures that will increase the likelihood that people suffering from repetitive stress injuries will report those injuries to their employers and public health officials.
True, most supports the claim made in the last sentence. It's going to be D. Some of the largest businesses in the province have already voluntarily instituted standards similar to those of the new law. That would best support the claim made in the last statement.
Are you sure?
Which will be dramatically reduce the number of repetitive stress injuries in our province. If it's widely enforced.
Okay, I like the conviction. Here we go. The answer is A. So the answer is most people in the province who experience repetitive stress injuries work for businesses that have at least 9 employees. What are your thoughts on that?
The new law requires at least 9 workers to create safer work environments. But they're saying that most of the people in the province who experience repetitive stress supports the claim. I didn't read the question. So because most of the provinces in the area already have 9 employees and they have these stress injuries, she's now saying that you need to have more workers employing at least to create safer work environments. Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
And you actually just pointed out another thing that is part of LSAT practice. When you're reading the question, underlining those words that you really need to look at. So like last sentence would be very important. What most supports would be really important. So you did that yourself. Oh, well, I see where the words in the question kind of dictate what my answer should be. We'll go to number 4. Which one of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? As you can see, some of these are very argument heavy. You're making a claim and then you're responsible as a test taker to figure out how the answers relate to the claim. So patents are issued only for inventions that are both novel and useful. Because of rapid advances in the field of computer science, an extremely high number of patents issued last year were issued for computer algorithms. However, a new law prohibits the issue of patents for computer algorithms, and thus the number of patents issued this year will be significantly less than it would have been otherwise. Again, the question is which one of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? A, were it not for the new law, some computer algorithms would receive patents this year. B, last year more than half of the patents issued were for computer algorithms. C, the field of computer science is responsible for the majority of recent inventions. D, of the computer algorithms that were submitted for patents in the past several years, most were eventually issued patents. E, more patents for novel and useful inventions were issued last year than will be issued this year.
Okay, so which one of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? The assumption on which the argument depends, it would have to be A, were it not the new law, some computer algorithms would receive patents this year, if I'm understanding the question correctly. Which one of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends? So you could only argue this if A was true, correct?
Are you sure?
Well, it's between A and E, but I think it's A.
Okay.
Were it not for the new law, some Sure. Yeah.
You are correct. Good job. On to the next one. This is one that is a lot shorter than the others. Which one of the following is most similar in its reasoning to the argument above? All load-bearing supports are essential structural elements. Some walls are not essential structural elements. Thus, some walls are not load-bearing supports. A. All items purchased at this store are returnable. Some of Pat's items are not returnable. Hence, some of Pat's items were not purchased at this store. B. All sandstone rocks are sedimentary rocks. All sedimentary rocks are formed by deposition of particles. So all sandstone rocks are formed by deposition of particles. C. All officers of this group are licensed and bonded. Some people who are licensed and bonded are not trustworthy. Therefore, some officers of this group are not trustworthy. D. All slipcovers are protective. Some ornamental lace items laid on furniture are not slipcovers. Thus, some ornamental lace items laid on furniture are not protective. E. All plays are entertainment. Some entertainment is not worthy of serious attention. It follows that some plays are not worthy of serious attention. My first question to you is, do you understand what the question is asking for?
I understand, but these are the types of questions that I was terrible at. English is my second language. I always struggled with English all through my life. And so this is one that I would absolutely take a little bit more time to dissect and highlight and underline specific words so that I can match up exactly what it's requesting, which is the most similar reasoning in the argument. So we're going to give me a minute here.
A few moments later.
All right, I'm going to go with A. All items purchased at this store are returnable. Some of Pat's items are not returnable. Hence, some of Pat's items were not purchased at this store.
So we're going to compare that against all load-bearing supports are essential structural elements. Some walls are not essential structural elements. Thus, some walls are not load-bearing supports.
Oh, wait.
Oh,
Now I got to rethink that. Now, all load-bearing supports are essential. No, I'm going to stick with A. Never mind.
Okay.
Because it's between A and E, but I think it's A.
Here we go. You are correct again. You're doing very well, Long.
Thanks. But this is how I do on all my tests. I always get down to the last two and I always second guess myself.
What was it about E that took you away from A a little bit?
Well, it follows the same sentence structure, right? It gives you a kind of that 100% like all these things are this. Therefore, if some of these are not, then that means it is some of these things. Yeah. So it gives that same sentence structure, but ultimately, A just matches more.
All right. You just did 5 logical reasoning questions. You ended up getting 4 out of the 5 correct. That's 80%. What I want to switch to now is reading comprehension. We might do a few of these, but overall, what was your impression of the logical reasoning examples that you've seen here?
Definitely, the more of these that you do, the better you can recognize patterns. I know that if I had done a Q bank of these for who knows, I don't know, a week, 2 weeks, that these questions would be a lot easier. So for any sort of test, big test that you go out there for, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you always do a Q bank and just make sure you get through as many questions as you can.
Agreed. Absolutely agree. Because when you do these questions over and over and over again, you get to the point where you start identifying patterns and identifying almost formulas for answering, where you've done 20 of these types. So now you know what words are important, what words stand out, so on and so forth.
2,000 years later.
Okay, Long. So after doing the logical reasoning, we're going to go ahead and switch over to reading comprehension. This is another part of the exam, obviously. And what reading comprehension does is it gives you a passage and then it asks you several questions based on that passage. I will read out the passage and then we'll allow Dr. Long some time to actually go through. And then we'll start answering some questions. While best known for her fiction, Edith Wharton, 1862 to 1937, also wrote extensively on architecture and decor. Her focus was on the designer who must work within the confines of an existing house, producing a good design upon the background of a faulty and illogical structure. This led to an extended meditation on the aesthetics of enclosed spaces, in which the very limitations that constrain artistic expression are seen as providing the framework that makes it possible. This theme of enclosure appears in her fiction as well, seen there as a metaphor for the multifarious constraints imposed by society and tradition. Around the turn of the century, these constraints were nowhere more evident than in the position of women in society. Although her fiction dealt compassionately with the intricacies and tragedies of middle-class women's lives, Wharton, unlike many feminists of her time, was pessimistic about the possibility of shattering the traditional barriers to women's advancement. Instead, she pursued a different but still feminist path, in the belief that women's best hope lay in gaining economic self-sufficiency within the confines of traditional society. To this end, she made herself an astute, self-reliant manager of her own career. She supported herself by writing at a time when most women writers were either unable to do so or were forced, unlike Wharton, to write under male pseudonyms. Here, her skepticism about the value of more radical social change reflected a basic faith in many aspects of traditional society. The metaphor of enclosure expressed her ambivalence toward a society that she perceived as both confining and at the same time providing needed structure. This ambivalence was expressed in Wharton's aesthetic vision as well. In her architectural writings, her sympathies lay more with the interior design, who has to work within given constraints to make a house livable, than with the architect, who is given a much freer hand and, in her opinion, too often produces unlivable spaces in the name of artistic autonomy. This preference is in keeping with her vehement rejection of those artists and movements that, on the surface at least, most represented change and that called for, among other things, the abandonment of the closed forms of mainstream genres. In her own fiction, Warren frequently chose to work in the genre of the short story, which is the most constrained and concentrated of prose genres and which requires the writer to adapt to the predetermined literary conventions, such as fast-paced beginning and dramatic conclusions, that the public expected. At the same time, she recognized that stories must, to some extent, dictate their own structures. Since the competing claims of tradition and individual autonomy constitute a recurrent theme in Wharton's short stories, form reflects content in these cases by incorporating the same dialect of enclosure. That was a lot. So, Long, this first question says, the passage suggests that Wharton would most likely to agree with which one of the following statements about cultural traditions. A, repressive traditions can be overcome only gradually because the beneficiaries of those traditions will work to preserve them. B, the constraints imposed by tradition, burdensome though they may be, are valuable because of the culture they make possible. C, emphasizing the strengths of traditional culture rather than its weaknesses is essential in good literature. D, people must resign themselves to the manner in which cultural traditions enclose them because traditions reflect a cultural consensus. E, traditions continue because they reflect an enduring wisdom greater than the ephemeral dictates of the individual will. And I will give you a few minutes.
I am going to say B on this one. The constraints imposed by tradition, burdensome though they may be, are valuable because of the culture they make possible. Throughout the entire passage, she talks about making change, but change within the boundaries that are already set forth. So she's not someone that really steps outside of the box. She wants to work with what she has. And that's what this statement seems to express.
Okay, let's show the answer. Dr. Long, you are correct once again. In preparation for law school, there is a lot of reading and there is a lot of comprehension of that reading, whether you're reading legal prose, whether you're reading the law, whether you're reading case law. And so it's very important for any student going into law school to have the ability to read and comprehend efficiently. I always recommend that if you're looking at going to law school, start reading if you haven't already. Generally, by the time you get into college, I think that there's some individuals that read a ton, and there are some individuals that maybe rely on audiobooks or more so podcasts or just don't like to read. But it is essential that you get your reading efficiency up to par in order to be successful in law school because you have to deal with questions like this. What's your feedback regarding this question? How did it make you feel as far as doing logical questions and then jumping on over to reading comprehension?
Makes me realize this is why I would never go to law school. I don't like this sort of question. I don't like these sort of readings. And like you said, it is a big interpretation, reading something and interpreting it and analyzing it, that's not my strong suit. I'm sure that if I was forced to do it, I could do it well enough, but not something that I would find enjoyment in. What we do in medical school is completely different. We learn it, brute force memory, and then as we go along, we then connect the dots to understand how one thing gets to another. So you're kind of seeing a progression, whereas this is kind of just analysis with analysis and analysis. It's just that's a lot more than I would like to do, especially with words.
Yeah, and kind of the unique thing about reading and comprehension in general is obviously there's a right answer here, but when you get into the law, you're then able to free flow your arguments. If you can get creative, if you can find case law that supports a position, or if you can find a Supreme Court ruling that supports your position, then you can, I don't want to say manipulate, but you can massage that argument into what you're trying to present. Part of it is just being able to make these statements and back them up with evidence. But if you can change perspective on something and look at it from a different position, you can be successful with an argument that may or may not have a lot of ground.
Now, these questions remind me of research papers that we have to read. So data papers that come out about specific medications or treatments, these these companies or systems that are funding that research will then put out papers. And you, as the physician, if you want to prescribe this medication, you want to make sure you understand the mechanism of action, all the results and the side effects that have come out of it. But you also have to be able to understand the analysis of the data. This really is paying homage to that sort of analysis, mind thinking, and reading comprehension that we also have in the medical field. Luckily, once you come out as an attending, if you're not working in academics, you really don't have to deal with too much of that research analysis, except by the things that you want to do for your own patients. Recently, we had these new oral Wegovy pills come out. They had data out for those specific medications. And so I went through the data, read through it so that I could then counsel my patients moving forward when they had questions. So you always want to try to be as knowledgeable as you can and as up to date as you can.
And that lends itself to another point of interpretation. How do you as an individual, based on your experience and based on the data that you're reading, interpret something like a research paper? When you're reading that research paper and you're seeing the data that's been selected to back up whatever findings are in that research paper, you then work your way through, okay, is this data reliable? Can I trust this research outlet? You start going through your experiences to then make an assessment on how good that research is or how good it isn't. That interpretation is really important. Another unique thing within the reading comprehension is there's a lot of big words used here. And I go back to when I was in college, I felt like I was a very strong reader. I read a lot. But when you go through reading something like this passage alone is very, very heavy. It's not an easy read. So one, I'm impressed by the fact that you were able to answer that question so quickly without really having to go back and do the heavy reading again. But the words, the prose, the way that it's presented, you really have to put in the time to understand what's going on. And you have to pay attention to the words because, as we've said before, words matter. I'm very impressed by the fact that you were able to wrap that around your head so quickly. And I say that because we had little edit between the time that Long read the passage to when he actually responded. All right, Long, we're on to the second question. Same passage, just different question. The passage suggests that the author would most likely agree with which one of the following statements about feminism during the period of Wharton's lifetime. A, feminism mainly aimed to change middle-class women's lives. B, feminism inspired a large number of women to pursue successful careers as writers. C, feminism lost popularity because of its failure to make headway against the barriers to women's advancement. D, feminism could take different forms while still remaining committed to the advancement of women. E, feminism was based on the view that the key to women's advancement lay in eliminating the economic rather than the political obstacles confronting women.
It's going to be E. Feminism was based on the view that the key to women's advancement lay in eliminating the economic rather than the political obstacles confronting women. And that's specifically right in the middle of that second paragraph where it talks about she has the belief that women's best hope lay in gaining the economic self-sufficiency within the confines of the traditional society.
Okay, let's look at the answer. Long, it is D.
I was pretty sure of it too.
You were, and you were very convincing in your answer. So the answer was D. Feminism could take different forms while still remaining committed to the advancement of women. Again, these questions give a more right answer, but there's an explanation here. So it says the passage draws connections between her fiction and her nonfiction writings about architecture and decor. In both, Wharton focused on finding opportunities for creative expression within a set of constraints. In her writing on architecture, she focused on the interior designer who must work within the confines of the existing house. Wharton had little sympathy for architects who she thought often abused creative freedom to produce unlivable spaces. In general, Wharton rejected artists who favored radical change, including those who wanted to abandon the closed forms of traditional literary genres. She herself frequently chose to work in the genre of the short story, the most constrained prose genre. Wharton's views about the value of working within constraints and her skepticism about radical change were also reflected in her political views. Although she was a feminist, she didn't think that shattering the traditional barriers to women's advancement was possible or even necessarily desirable. Wharton thought that women should instead try to gain economic self-sufficiency within the confines of traditional society. This reflected a belief that although society was constraining, it also provided needed structure. So I find it interesting that the explanation almost supports your answer position.
Exactly. That explanation, I feel, still supports my E, not supporting the D.
I would agree with you here. But for whatever reason, D is the correct answer. This is a constant frustration with test prep and actually doing the test, because you have both of us reading that saying, I actually like E a lot better than I like D. I think E is a little bit more applicable, but D is the seemingly more right answer. And even when we read the explanation, it just doesn't click. I'm sure if you and I had hours to reread the passage and highlight and underline, we would probably end up getting there and just willing it to be that we understood D. But here we're both really confused by that response. And that's something that you will face in your test taking. Now, granted, you only have a certain period of time when you're taking the test, but when you're doing your practice exams, this is where you really have to lean into understanding why.
During the LSAT, though, after the fact, are you able to contest questions, like questions that you think should be answered differently? Do you have that
No,
opportunity?
I don't think so. And I don't think you're even given the answers to the question. I think that you just end up with your score and it is what it is. And the other thing to note is that there's also experimental questions thrown in here. This, in theory, could have been an experimental question where it's not being scored against the test taker, but it allows the test providers to understand this may have been a poorly written question. We probably shouldn't use something like this for the future.
And is there a process to do like a little curve, a test curve? Because in with the MCAT world, if there is a question that say 95% of test takers get wrong, they will usually throw it out so that they can move the curve closer to where the average should be. Is that something that the LSAT does?
It's my understanding that the LSAT may have a curve. It's a process called test equating, which statistically adjusts scores for differences in difficulty between test versions, try to ensure fairness, essentially. But it's not a traditional curve based on how others perform, but rather like a conversion where harder tests allow you to miss more questions for the same scaled score. And trying to understand each year, they're trying to make sure that the test itself stays the same level of difficulties. They're trying to make sure that the previous year's test is similar to this year's test. You want that 170 that you're getting to be the same 170 the students got 5 years ago as they're getting today, as they got 20 years ago. All right, let's do it. The passage contains information that suggests which one of the following. A, in order to avoid alienating editors and readers, Wharton sacrificed her feminist ideals. B, Wharton saw expanded political representation as the most effective way to improve women's conditions. C, Wharton likened society to an unlivable house that must be rebuilt from the ground up. D, Wharton concentrated on the short story because it was the most lucrative of genres. E, Wharton preferred piecemeal to wholesale experimentation in the arts.
It's going to be E on that one, because all of these others are pretty opposite of what she said. So I think that one makes the most sense. She likes to make small changes rather than big.
All right.
And that's what that statement's saying.
Final answer.
Final answer.
You're correct again. You are correct again. I'm also very impressed that as we're working our way through, you're not having to do a lot of back and forth with rereading the entire prompt. That might go to your ability to memorize things. You have mentioned before, even as a doctor in testing, it was brute force memory and then piecing things together, connecting the dots. And similar in law, there's a lot of memory that goes into law, but it's from a different task of trying to pull facts and patterns and what was said years ago and pulling out pieces of evidence and making those connections. But I'm actually very impressed with your memory as you go through these, because you are not taking a lot of time to reread the passage that's here.
I'll take my honorary law degree from Lawyer Nik.
If I could give you one, I would. All right, 4. Which one of the following best describes the author's attitude towards Wharton's working within the structure of the short story? I feel like there's a lot of alliteration there. A, indignation at the necessity for compromise. B, regret tempered by admiration of Wharton's consequent economic independence. C, appreciation of the genre's suitability to Wharton's concerns. D, approval because it opened the door for other women writers. E, ambivalence toward the external limitation imposed on Wharton's artistic expression. They're getting wordy with these answers.
They are. This is one of those where the vocabulary really gets to me, and I really would have to sit down and really think about every single one of these. Indignation of the necessity for compromise, regret tempered by admiration. I think this is going to be E, ambivalence towards the external limitation imposed on Wharton's artistic expression.
All right. The answer was C, appreciation of the genre's suitability to Wharton's concerns.
For me, it was between C and E. If I took a little bit more time, I probably could have gotten it right and talked myself into one or the other.
All right, Long. You are 2 and 2. Last one. So this is so you can get what the 60% on the reading comprehension. No pressure. In the passage, the author primarily seeks to A, point out how Wharton created opportunities for self-expression within established conventions. B, explain how Wharton overcame society's constraints and became a financially successful novelist. C, contrast Wharton's life and attitudes with traditional stereotypes placed upon women. D, identify the origin of Wharton's interest in architecture and design. E, show that contrary to appearances, Wharton was a feminist.
I'm going to go with A. Point out
A.
how Wharton created opportunities for self-expression within established conventions.
Final answer?
Final answer.
Question 10 of 10. You are correct. Now you've worked your way through 5 reading comprehension questions. How'd you feel about those 5 questions?
A little bit more cumbersome, but that's how these reading comprehension questions usually are. We do have similar ones on the MCAT and similar ones to some of our steps too.
Yeah, it was very interesting kind of seeing you work through it, and you had a lot of conviction when you went into every answer. It didn't seem like you were second guessing yourself a lot, which I think is also a good test taking quality. Because I think a lot of students, when they're taking a test, they get down to those final 2, and it's what decision do I make? And you start getting in your head a little bit of, I need to get this one right. If I get this one wrong and the last one was wrong, then my percentage points are going to go down. I'm not going to score, and then I'm not going to get to law school, and then I'm not going to make my parents proud, and then I'm going to live under a bridge. Like that is sometimes what test taker anxiety is all about. But you had a lot of conviction going into it, which is very, very impressive as far as your test taking skills.
Well, it's also because this test is not real for me, so I can be a little bit more, because it doesn't matter if I get it right or wrong. I also get test anxiety. I'm not the best test taker. I do go down to those last 2 questions, and I usually do struggle. But at the end of the day, you still have to make that decision, and you got to stick with it. That comes with the training that I get as a doctor, because when you make that decision, you got to own it.
Yeah, that's very important. When you make the decision, you really do have to own it, because you want your patient or your client to have that type of confidence in you as the professional that they're paying to help them with, like we've talked before, your life and death situation. And for you, you're also taking in a lot of information all at once. We've talked about your patient consults where you have to sit there and really pull out what's important, what's not important, ask the appropriate questions, and get down to solving the problem that you're dealing with your client. So before we end, any test-taking advice you can give to students, whether it's LSAT or MCAT, that you think would help?
Depending on which test you take, I think based on the LSAT, I think you're right. Reading comprehension is really important. So making sure that reading is something that you enjoy, something that you do regularly, so that you don't get fatigued. Someone like me who does not read as much, I could see how if I was taking a 2-hour-long test, sitting and reading through all these prompts, it can be draining. And then something that we already discussed, the more questions that you can do, that you can familiarize yourself with the patterns, it would be helpful. The other thing is that sometimes when you do so many Q banks, sometimes those questions can actually show up on your actual test, or similar thoughts and ideas and answers. And so those are kind of my 2 pieces of advice for test taking.
I would agree. I would definitely agree. For those considering law school, don't worry about trying to go read a penal code or understand civil procedure or understand the law. Just go read a book. Go pick up your favorite book, your favorite series, give it a read, practice these questions. Go online and look up free tests before you go and find the paid version. And then if you are going to venture into paid test help, just do your research and figure out which one fits well with your current financial circumstance. As I mentioned before, I took the test just by buying a book at Barnes & Noble. And I worked through it. And although my score wasn't the highest score I could have achieved, I mean, I took the test twice, I still got into law school. I still became a successful lawyer, and I'm still moving forward in my career. If you're ever feeling stressed out about it, that's natural. Anxiety is good when you're going into a test, because it means you're taking it seriously. But there are a lot of resources out there that you can definitely find to help with test taking.
If you're out there listening, comment below. Let us know your resource that you like to use. It might help someone out there that is looking for better test taking advice.
Absolutely. That's this episode of the Medico-Legal Brief, where medicine meets the law. We had a fun episode going over LSAT questions. I look forward to doing some MCAT questions in the future, Long. But with that, this has been Dr. Long and Lawyer Nik. As Dr. Long had mentioned, comment below. If you haven't already, like, subscribe, and follow. YouTube, Spotify, TikTok, the whole gambit. We look forward to seeing you next time, 10 a.m. Central on Wednesdays. Y'all have a good one. Yes, we're doctors. Yes, we're lawyers. No, this podcast is not medical or legal advice. Do not take anything we say as a reason to perform your own heart surgery, represent yourself in court, or diagnose your neighbor's rash. This is for entertainment only. Think of it like hanging out with your smartest, wittiest friends, not a substitute for an actual appointment. If you act on anything we say without talking to your own professional, that's on you. Seriously, don't do that.